You've been asking about auction drafts. So, before we do a mock one, let's discuss the auction drafts. Let's discuss tips, strategies, ideas, how they work, and let's hear from Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, but they call me Zach because they don't know what the F run with me. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter, as always, at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at LockedOnFantasyBasketball. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September the 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com right now to get started. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and we are available on all platforms. Voice is really rough today. Apologies for this. I just got no boost in it. There's no balls to it. So I apologize. It's a little scratchy. Just doesn't sound right. My bad. We're talking auctions, like I said. They are the draft that gets your limited coverage. There are a few reasons for that. There will be people who ask me about, do some auctions. I will. There's going to be multiple auction mock drafts. Part of the reason I don't do as many is A, they take 2+ hours to do. And B, while there is utility in doing them, the repeatability of what happens at an auction is pretty low. So what I do in my auction will definitely not be what happens in yours, because as soon as players and weird orders and biddings change, then the whole dynamic changes, which is great from a real perspective of a draft. But in terms of what are you getting out of an auction mock, it's probably less interesting. Part of the other reason is when we talk about rankings and tiers and valuations of players, while a snake draft is obviously not as good, it's obviously not as good as an auction, it's easier to understand. And just so few people play an auction. So it's easy to say this guy is a top 50 player or a third round guy versus he's a $20 player or a $6 player, because those valuations and variations change. If you're in a 10-team league, a 12-team league, a 14-team league, a 16-team league, a 20-team league snake draft, a top 50 player is basically a top 50 player. If you're in a 10-team auction, a top 50 player is worth a certain amount. If you're in a 12-team league, that same player is worth a different amount. If you're in a 14-team league, that player is worth a different amount. If you're in a 16-team league, he's worth a different amount. It changes. So there's not this guy's a $20 player because he's a 20, he's a 25, he's a 30, he's a 15, he's a 12. So that's part of the reason why me and why people in the industry in general, whatever sport that is, we don't really talk in depth about the auction values of players and don't do many auction drafts. Time, the fact that not many people do them, and that valuation discussion around players is not a thing that is static. It varies a lot. But let's talk about them, because this is the best way to play fantasy basketball. I don't think there's really any debate about that. I think that an auction draft is it's the best way. It's the best way to draft. It's the most fun way to. In fact, the most fun way to draft is an in-person auction. Everyone gets together in a room, a bar, whatever. You have an auctioneer. That is the best possible fantasy draft experience that you will ever encounter. The best, without question. It is the fairest way to do stuff, the fairest way to draft. But there are a lot of things about it. So if you haven't done an auction, or you have in the past and you want to do more of them, and I think we're going to get more of a push for it with the emergence of Victor Wembanyama and the frustrations that can be had through snake drafts, that more people are going to want to do these. And someone said to me, because they were asking, why don't you do more auction? I'm sorry for going off tangent here. And I said, part of the reason is that they take a long time. He said, yeah, who cares though? An hour and a half extra on draft night. We're talking about an investment for season-long fantasy that's 25 weeks. It's half a year. It's 6 months. Who cares if it's an extra hour? And I understand that sentiment. people do have different things in life and different priorities, and there's familiarities and all that sort of stuff. But when you do break it down that way, it's an hour over 6 months. The same thing when people talk about buy-ins in leagues, and it's like, it's $50, okay? That's $50. It's $2 a week over 25 weeks. And not everyone has money like that, but we look at fantasy and we look at it as like these short-term investments where this is a 5-month long endeavor of playing in the league. So whatever we do is a long-term thing. So let's talk about auctions. What is it? It's a draft where we bid. Simple as that. We use a budget to select players. All of the players are available to every manager. The players get nominated. You don't just pick who you want. The draft is dynamic. Like I said, it changes. Every single auction you do, even if it's the same people involved in the same player pool, it changes every time. It's a bidding draft. We know this. You chuck a name out there, you bid on it, the highest bid, once the timer runs down, wins. They get the player. They are called salary cap auction drafts now because of language concerns, which I understand. The reason I don't usually refer to them as salary cap drafts is that salary cap leagues are a different thing altogether. There are leagues where players have salaries assigned to them, whether that's real salary or other salary, so that can lead to confusion. I think there's got to be a better name than a salary cap league if we're going to rename auctions. So that's why I tend to refer to the auction, but I understand the sensitivity around that. But we're just bidding. We're bidding on getting that player onto our team. That's where we're at. That's what an auction draft is. Instead of just choosing a player, you go in there and you bid on them. So we use a budget. Whatever that budget is, the default budget is $200. You might set it at $300. You might set it at $1,000. You might set it at $100. I would recommend never going lower than $200 on a draft budget, because the larger amount of money that you provide, the more individual striations there are in the way that you can do it. Because even if you've got a $100 budget, you can't bet 50 cents. Right? So that a $1 player becomes worth 1% versus 0.5% in a $200 budget. And there's the different levels. Like, you can do 1 or you can do 2 or you can do 3. But if you go to like a $300 budget, the differences between 1, 2, and 3 is, 3 times as small. More variation in prices. And that is what we're doing. We're looking at an auction. We're looking to just get that extra that value in and really determine what the player's value is. When we look at the ability to draft any player, now that is true to an extent, but once you start drafting, like, you will run out of money and you can't draft whoever you want, obviously. But theoretically, and not even theoretically, practically, when you head into an auction draft, you have the ability to target any player you want. If you were in a snake draft and you're picking at 9, you do not have access to Victor Wembanyama. You don't have access to Jokic or Doncic or Shea. You can't get any of those players. But even if you're nominating 9th in an auction, you can get whoever you want. You just got to plan it out. So you have the ability to get whoever you want. It's not a random drawing that determines who gets that player. And there is a pretty large imbalance in snake drafts. That's why we talk about third round reversal a lot. So you get that ability to really target and build your team the way that you want. So auction draft, we have nominations. We don't choose people. So I go first. I put a player out there. Everyone decides what they're going to bid. The timer runs down. We see who gets him. The next person in line, they throw the player out there. They nominate them. There's all strategy, which we're going to talk about nomination strategy later on. But it's a different process. These are the very, very basics of an auction league. These are the process to choose a player is not just selecting that player. So what else do we need to pay attention to? The draft is dynamic. It changes. As soon as one player goes off the board and then 2 players go off the board, the price that they go off changes things. If one manager chooses the first 2 players that get picked and they spend a lot of money on them, well, that manager then basically puts themselves out of play for the next 30 or so players, whatever it is. But if we do the next draft and Wembanyama doesn't get nominated one, we nominate Andrew Nembhard. And then with the second pick, we nominate Isaiah Hartenstein. And two different people pick them. One guy might have lost $1, one guy might have lost $4. So that it's very different to the next one. And every single move that gets made in an auction, every single bid that happens, every player that goes out, every order change makes it unique and makes your strategy need to adjust. And that's, I think, part of the appeal of the auction is that there are these many different strategies that we can do. We'll talk about why it's good to do an auction in a sec. But today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. We have spoken about FanDuel for a long time. They've been a great supporter of this show. They're America's number one sportsbook, of course. But now, all the way through until September the 22nd, we've got something a little bit different for you. Every customer of FanDuel who spends $5, who bets $5, you get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With your YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market NFL game. All you need is that Google account. You need a valid form of payment. And of course, you can cancel that at any point. But while it's free, why would you? You wouldn't. That's the thing. But if that's not enough of a good offer. FanDuel has something special for our listeners as well this weekend. Make sure you check out FanDuel's Profit Boost in the app. Use it for FanDuel's double your winnings all Sunday, the 8th of September. Pre-game moneyline bets. Profit Boost will be live starting, on Friday, the 6th of September. We're trying to read these backwards dates. View your account page now. You can learn more about that boost. Go to FanDuel.com right now and download America's number one sportsbook. And don't forget to gamble responsibly. Okay, so the basics out of the way. We talk about what an auction actually is. So now let's talk about why would we decide to do this? Why would we do an auction draft? Well, you get that complete team control. You determine what you're going to do with your team. There's strategic depth decisions. Well, the strategy is deeper. You don't have to worry about getting a bad draft slot. There's no such thing as a draft slot. An auction rewards more knowledge and more fantasy skill. It's a more engaging draft. You have to pay attention to every pick. It's a fairer system as well, given that everybody's got the opportunity to choose a player to build a team the way they want. That's just fair. So let's talk about the complete team control. I think that's relatively obvious what we're talking about there, is that like you do have that ability to build your team however you want. We'll talk about stars and scrubs and balanced build modes later on. We'll talk about the ability to go heavy into punts, because you don't have to worry about what player's available at what spot. ADP means nothing. You have control exactly over what your team needs. We'll talk about the strategic depth. It's just more strategy. The money's come off here. How do I adjust my pricing now that all these guys have gone underpriced? All these guys have gone overpriced. What does this mean? And we talk about, and you could talk about whether you're a baseball fan or not, I don't know, but I'll even apply it to basketball, right? Is when we address stats and when we talk about numbers, everything has got to be in context. In baseball, so many of the stats that are the major advanced things that people look at, OPS plus, WRC plus, WAR, right? It's all environment specific, park factors, and what's the run environment of the league at the moment. If you're hitting at a certain level, that's great, but how does that compare now versus 1970? In basketball, you see Basketball Reference doing this stuff with things like True Shooting Plus and True Shooting Add and that sort of stuff, which, where is your true shooting percentage compared to league average this season? And that's where the strategy, that's like a long-winded thing, but like individual context, draft room context, the strategy of changing your mind based on, is your league a bunch of insane people who's spending $100 on each of the top 5 players? Well, that means that things are going to be different. Prices for everyone's going to be all over the shop, and you've got to be able to have that strategy or the ability to have that strategy to adapt. Because if you don't, you're actually cooked. One of the other reasons we look at is you don't have to worry about the bad draft slots. You hear this question. I hear it all the time. You hear it less than me because you're not probably doing this show. But the question is, what pick do I want? What's the best spot to draft this year? What's the worst spot to draft this year? That doesn't exist in an auction. Even like what order you're nominating, it doesn't really matter. There's no such thing as bad luck of the draw in an auction. You control everything. The better you are, the more ball knowledge you have, the better you are at fantasy, the better you are at numbers, which is what fantasy is, honestly. The better you are at planning and regulation, you do better. The downside of that, I guess, for an auction is that if someone is a beginner or someone's not experienced, they will get cooked. In a snake draft scenario, you can make bad picks, but if you sort of follow roughly an ADP guide, you roughly follow a pre-rank, you roughly do this, you will field a team that becomes somewhat competitive. If you're in an auction and you do not know what you're doing, you might not spend any money and be left with 11 players that cost $5 each, and you go out of there with $150 in your back pocket, which you can't do anything with. You will get cooked. So that is a downside, but on the plus side, it rewards your knowledge. If you know what you're doing, if you know players, if you know context, you're going to do well. That is key. It is the fairest way to draft. Like I said, the randomness doesn't come into it. The randomness of where I am picking doesn't play a part in this. It's not how it works. Auctions, what are the negatives? Well, I said that already. The time-consuming nature. There is a steep learning curve. You do have to prepare for an auction draft. You pretty much can't go in and wing it. There's a lot more in-draft pressure and adjustments that need to be made. And you can't take a snooze. If you're in a snake draft and you're picking at 12 and then you go 12, 13 and you're back on the clock at 48, 49, you can take a little bit of time off. You can't. You have to, in most cases in an auction format, you need to be paying attention the whole time. Because theoretically, you have a chance to get every single player. The time is long. You can knock out a snake draft in 50 minutes, an hour, 45 maybe. You'll be lucky to get an auction done in 2, maybe 2.5 hours. It's an investment, and not everyone can do that. That is a very clear downside. It's a downside for me even recording mock drafts. It takes a long time. The learning curve. You've got to do a bunch of mocks. You probably have to play in competitive leagues and get cooked initially, unless you've got a real understanding of how the dynamics work. And for some people, they want to just be casual about it. And that can be harder to get enough people together to do that. You got to prep. You can't just, I've got my draft tonight, let's see what happens. He plays for that team, does he? What's our budget again? Who am I looking at? Because if you don't have an idea of who you're taking and what happens there and what's my backup plan, well, I guess the phrase of the day is going to be cooked, because that is what you're going to be. The other downsides of this auction salary cap draft is the pressure in the draft room builds. It's higher. You've got to make that decision, and if you miss out on a guy, then you go, well, I've got too much money left, so what do I do here? Who do I get? I have to get this guy. Then you put yourself into overbidding, cascading problems. All these things add up, and it is a more stressful and it's a more difficult environment. There is, I think, zero question about that. You can't switch off. You can't not pay attention. And that makes it hard, I guess, even doing the mocks as well, because I'm trying to talk and we're trying to go through it, and someone will go off the board, and if you're not paying attention, they slide through at $2 and it was a $12 play. They go, well, I didn't know one bid, but no one saw it, because we all switched off at the same time, which does happen. And of course, that leads to people getting some perhaps extra advantages that you may, or there's not even an advantage. They did the right thing. They paid attention, but you can't switch off. So when we're talking about an auction, what are some of the strategies that exist? The two major ones that exist are stars and scrubs and a balanced build. There is also a value-based drafting idea, which I guess sort of plays into both of those other ones, but it's just something I wanted to mention additionally on top of that, because we hear the other two all the time, rightfully so. They are really the two strategies in an auction. So what are they? What are your drafting strategies in an auction? We talk stars and scrubs. What does it mean? What it usually means is, well, I think it's relatively straightforward, but it means you get high-end players and fill out your roster with bad players. The general, like if you're in a snake draft, you by definition of the way that the draft works, you draft one first-round player. You might say you got a first-round guy that slipped into round 2, but you take one first-round player. in a Stars and Scrubs auction build, you might take the top 2 players. You might spend $170 of your $200 budget on drafting Wembanyama and Jokic, or Doncic and Shea, or AD and Giannis, or whatever. You might take 3 of the top 7 for $160 and then fill out your other 10 roster spots with $40. That's Stars and Scrubs. That is an idea, and you will look at that and go, that's great. Look at the top end talent that I've got, but that is what that strategy is. Balanced is the exact opposite. Now, there is a balanced format where you could say, well, I'll balance it like I'm drafting in a snake draft. It doesn't really work that way in an auction, unfortunately, because we talk about, and I've talked about ordinality a ton on this show, about how the player that's at number 1 versus number 2 versus 3 versus 4 is not the difference between 31, 32, 33, 34, but we pick them in that order because that's how a snake works. In an auction, we're not bound by that. So the guy that goes at number 1 is not worth 70, and then it's 69, can get his 68, 67, and then the guy that's the 30th best player is not worth 30, and the guy's worth 29, and the guy's worth 28 the pick after that, because you might have 4 players who all go at $20. You might have, and that might be the player that's the 15th best player, but that doesn't jive versus a $70 first player. And then the guy that's 15th might go for 20. That's a low number. That's not right. But the 15th guy might go for 20, and the 40th guy might go for 19. Right? So we have that difference. So we can't really do that. I'll get a first round guy, I'll take a second round guy, I'll take a third round guy. It doesn't really add up. A balanced approach to me is I will probably ignore all first round players. I probably won't take a single player who is worth $50. I probably won't take a $40 player. But my approach will be is that I will attack the mids. I'll DeMar DeRozan it. I'll be a mid-range assassin. And I'll grab 12 players who in a snake draft would go between round 3 and round 7. Very different approach. We're not getting any of the stars. We're just getting all of the mid-round guys. That is a different procedure. Some like it, some don't, and we'll talk about what I think is best soon. The value-based drafting is a process you can sort of do in Snake as well. It's about looking at, I think this guy's a $50 player, man. He's only sitting at 35. I'm just going to take him. Like just finding the guys that you think become undervalued in a draft. Usually that skews towards the balanced approach. But you might see a first-round guy that you think is a $60 player and he's sitting at 51. You go, well, this is great. I'll get $8 extra bonus here. I'll take that. Probably not one that gets used that much, but I do think there is some utility in it. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. When we were children, maybe some of us now, but a lot of us, when we're children, have a level of curiosity. We want to learn. We want to pick up new things. We want ideas and all that sort of stuff. As adults, it gets harder to do that. Commitments, just the natural way that our body and our brains age. But curiosity is great. It does help improve your mood, and therapy can be a way that you can help rediscover your back-to-school era. So, if you've been thinking of starting therapy, maybe learning a new skill like auction drafting, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. You fill out all of your details online. They match you up with a therapist who's the best fit for you. You have a session, you see how it goes. If it doesn't work, actually, you can just change to another therapist, which is going to be what you need, hopefully, and do all that stuff. So, if you're thinking of starting therapy, well, BetterHelp's the place to go. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. Okay, so let's talk about these specific draft strategies. Stars and Scrubs, that means you're acquiring the top-end talent. That's great. That's a big pro of that. It's easier to fill around those top-end guys because you've got more streaming ability. You just pick up guys off the waiver wire, and you got your core there. You know how you are. You can dominate a matchup with the top-end players. These are all the positives of going with this mode. The negatives, well, you do lack depth, obviously. And one of the bigger ones is an injury and an imbalance in schedule is felt so much more in this sort of in a stars and scrubs based approach. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail now. In terms of your ability, you're obviously getting the high-end talent. We love the high-end players. We love Jokic. We love Wemby. We want Shea. We love Doncic. We love Giannis. We love the players who put up big numbers. Getting 2 of those on your team is the thing you just cannot do in a snake draft. We love that idea. Having the top-end talent, they are the best players in the NBA. They are the best players in fantasy. That can be more fun. It can be more fun. And that is really, really, we play this stupid hobby for fun. So you do that. It enables you to be able to find those breakouts and stream with reckless abandon easier. You know what your core is. You know what your main guys are contributing. They're contributing a bulk of your numbers. So you just pick and choose the guys that you want to fit around them. That becomes a lot easier because you've got your guys with the big strengths. So you can just pick little bits and pieces to fill in the gaps. Probably is a little bit easier to do that in a stars and scrubs type situation. It's also, like I said, it's more fun, very clearly. But you can dominate. You've got your top 2 guys, and they both have 4 games, and they both go off. You can actually and then your other guys hit all at the same time, while you can be in a really strong position. You can be in a really strong position. I guess part of the idea of a stars and scrubs is that it probably does raise your ceiling, but I would also say that it lowers your floor. And that's going to depend on what sort of a person you are and how you want to approach a draft, because your depth is obviously bad. If you are spending, let's say you're spending $160 on 2 to 3 players, you mean you're getting $4 players, which are all like 90s, 100s, 150s, complete bench scrubs. It limits your ability to get good depth in. It also limits your ability in draft to make any decision, because basically everyone else is going to have more money than you. So you go, I really want this guy. He's a nice sleeper for me. He's worth $4. And you go, the max I can actually bid is $5. And someone else puts $6 on, you're done. So it limits your flexibility. Your team has no depth. You can develop depth through some trades or smart waiver wire pickups, but coming out of the draft, you don't have depth. And the big one for me is that it really, really causes a problem with injuries and schedule. If you are going into a draft, an auction draft with fantasy playoffs, and you are spending $65 on Luka Doncic, and there is a 2-game playoff week, you are in massive trouble. Massive trouble. Because you are wanting these guys to carry the bulk of what you do. If you get an injury, a long-term injury to one of your top 3 guys, you are done. You cannot recover from that. Sure, you can add someone off the waiver wire, but the difference between a top 5 player and a waiver wire player, when your team is already filled with guys ranked between 110 and 140, is not going to make a difference. That the impact of injuries and schedule is huge. That's why I say that your floor in this sort of a build is much lower. On the other side, on the balanced draft, the pros and cons of this sort of a setup, you can create a very deep team. You can look at your team and go, there is not a single player on my team who traditionally would be considered outside the top 70. You've got flexibility in the draft. You can sort of grab a bunch of different players. The injury impact is lessened. Some might say it's less fun because you're relying upon Darius Garland and Fred VanVleet as your best players. You don't have the ability to really kick it up a notch and dominate a team necessarily. And that might not be something that appeals to you. And that's totally valid as well. We all have our ways of going about and what we want to get out of fantasy. So when I talk about developing depth, that's what I mean. Like, you won't have a top 20 player probably, but you might have 9 top 50 players. You might have 12 top 75 players. Your team is deep. So every day during the week, whoever's coming off your bench is better than the Stars or Scrubs' 5th best player. You're just cycling through these guys. It's unbelievably deep. That's what she said. So yeah, that is, to me, a very clear advantage. One of the other advantages of it is the flexibility in a draft because, like we know, there's only a certain amount of stars. There's only a top-end group. There is, by definition, 90 mid-range players. You don't get this guy, let me just get the next guy. It's $1 difference, $2 difference. You've got a lot of different ways you can go about it in those middle rounds. Way more flexibility to do what you need to do in those areas. And one of the biggest things, and this is where I go, like, do you want ceiling? Do you want floor? An injury is fine. It's not fine. Like, you don't want multiple injuries, but if your best player, who's the 30th best player, gets injured and you have to replace him with a waiver wire guy, the difference between the 30th best player and the waiver wire player is half compared to the number one player and a waiver wire player. And then you've got 6 other top 40 guys who are still on your roster. So there's an impact of it, but the impact is much lower. The impact is way lower when an injury strikes in a stars and scrubs build. It's just not, it's not as negative, clearly. Some of the, I guess, the downsides, you don't have the elite talent. You don't have the superstar. The NBA runs on superstars. Sometimes I wish it didn't, but it does. So you might equate that to being less fun, which is, again, a totally reasonable way of approaching the NBA and approaching fantasy. You want to have fun. And elite talent can bring that. You probably have less performance consistency. The good players are good because they put up big games consistently. The pretty good players, the mid players, can be really good. Let's use D'Angelo Russell. Or they can be terrible. He can have a run, D'Angelo, of being a top 30 player. He might have a run where he's 150th. And you never sort of know when that's going to happen. If you get a week where 6 of your guys are having down weeks, well, obviously not going to be particularly good for you, is it? We're talking auction. I think that a balanced build is better. Stars have inflated prices that are above their actual value. All of the value tends to open up in the middle rounds. The depth reduces your risk. It gives you flexibility and adaptability. It also enables you usually to be able to sit atop a Scrooge McDuck style pile of money. Whereas everyone's lost their money and you're sitting there and you've got it. Now there's a delicate balance. You've seen it in many of my mocks before where someone sits on it too long and then they can't spend it. But if you do plan it and time it correctly, you can just come in and just outbid everyone you want for the guys that you want that make your team, the juggernaut that you hope it's going to be. So I think that's a really important key point to this. So when we're talking about again, I think balanced is better. Now there are some really easy rules of thumb in this. The shallower your league, so once you get below 12 teams or 150 players rostered, stars and scrubs becomes more useful because the quality of players available on the waiver wire is higher. If you push past a 12-team league and you go to 14, 16, 18, the deeper you go, the worse that a stars and scrubs is. It almost never works because the prices inflate even more for the high-end players. And your replacement level guy, instead of being the 160th best guy off the waiver wire, it's the 220th best player who is bad, who is not producing numbers. So that downside and what you're filling the back end of your roster with is quite bad. So your general rule of thumb is the deeper your league is, the deeper your rosters are, the more balanced works. The shallower it is, the more stars and scrubs comes into play. If you're in an 8-team league with 100 guys rostered, I would not suggest doing a balanced build. If you're in a 12-team standard, I would. And it just pushes further into balanced the further you go into deepness or depth, that's the correct word, and size. So that, I say here that the stars' prices are inflated. They are. Everyone loves a star. The prices of what they go for are usually much higher than the actual value they return. You will routinely see them 56, 60. I saw someone show me that Victor Wembanyama went for $100 in a $200 budget. You cannot win that way, I don't think. I know Wemby is good. You can't win that way. If he starts going for $80 over a third of your budget, you can't win. It's so hard. You have to be so perfect and everyone else has to be terrible in your league to win. The prices are inflated almost without fail of the top end players. The mid-tier is where the value opens up, because often we look at this guy who's the 5th round player and think they're so much worse than the 3rd round player, but they're not. They're about the same. So you get these 4th or 5th or 6th round players that start getting prices if they're bad, but they're not. They're as good as the guy that goes at round 2, not quite, but the pricing is not set correctly usually through the market and through the way that projections get put out. The value always appears, I believe, in an auction draft in the mid-rounds. In that mid-range player, not rounds, because we don't have rounds really necessarily. That's where I believe the value appears, is in the mid-area. The depth that you have in a balanced build reduces the risk that you have from an injury, from a schedule problem. Like I said, like who you're replacing. That waiver wire guy replacing your top player is not as big of a difference versus if he was a top 2 player. It just doesn't matter as much. It's not as big of a drop-off. Gives you more flexibility and adaptability. You can build in different ways. You have different options if a player doesn't go your way. It's easier to find a waiver wire player who goes from nothing to being a top 60 player to just jump in and replace an injured guy versus you can't get a waiver wire guy to be a top 10 guy. That just is not a thing that exists, I don't think ever. I don't think that's ever happened in fantasy, where you can find that player sitting on the bench or on the waiver wire. So you've got that adaptability. And usually, you will sit on your cash. Now, you find most mock drafts, I do a lot of people will stick with this balanced build, and it makes those mocks a little bit harder to get value out of because everyone starts to sit back and that valuation's not as good. But if you sit there and you are the last person to even get a player and you've got more money than anyone else, it's usually a very good sign at a certain point. There becomes a tipping point where you got to start to spend. And what I usually find is if I'm in a draft where people who don't know me or aren't using my strategy, is that I will be the last person to select a player and I'll be the first person to finish my roster. Because I won't take the top guys and I'll draft 13 of the next 30 players and I'm out. Take all the mid-round guys and I'm done because I sat on my cash, I outbid everyone, I took all these guys and I'm off and running. That's how I view that. That's how I think that works best. Through many, many years and many, many auctions of experience doing it. So what else do we need to do in a draft? How do we prep? You got to know what your budget is. Is it 200? Is it 100? Is it 300? What are your league settings? What's your league size, roster size? What's your active versus bench split? Is it a daily versus weekly league? How do you structure your budget? How many $1 players are you going to have? Where do you get your player values from? You got to go and create a target list of players and their price ranges. Figure out how you're going to adjust in the draft. This is what I say when there's a lot of preparation that is required in an auction format. You've got to do all of these things that you don't really have to do in a snake. You've got to know what the settings are. The deeper it goes, think about it this way, right? There'll be people who go, well, the deeper a league goes, that means that the top players become more scarce, means I've got to spend more. That's a great mindset for your opponents to have. Because every time that your league expands and a new team comes in, there is $200, let's use 200, the default number, $200 extra in the total money pool of the league. So $200 extra dollars to be spent. Now that $200 does not get split evenly between every level of player. You will find that $200 that is extra, let's say it's 2 new teams coming in, 12 to 14, $400 coming in. That will not be spread evenly. Most of that will go towards the top 25 players with little sprinklings throughout the rest. Because you know what doesn't change? The back-end guys still go for $1. The last 30, 40 players go for $1. So that doesn't change. There's no inflation there. The players that are $1 players change because different guys come in, but the back-end is still $1. And the top end inflates even more. So the more money that comes in, the more the high-end prices rise. It's important to know your league settings. In a weekly league, you don't need to use your bench every game. So those guys you don't actually need to spend money on. If you have a situation where you've got 7 active and 7 bench, well, that means you do have a true bench. And probably 2 to 3 of those bench players won't be used. So you don't have to consider them part of your active. In a 10-3 split, a 10 active, 3 bench situation. We talk about this all the time. Daily changes. Every one of those players is an active player. You have no bench. You use every game of every player. So you have to assign resources to all of those guys. You have to be able to do that. But not everyone will. Most people will look at starters, I spend, bench, I don't. And in most daily changer spots, you want to at least devote some resources to running 12 deep because you will use all of those players. There won't be a situation where you don't use them. You got to know those settings. That's how you prep. You got to know how you're going to structure your budget. What are you doing? How are you planning it out? Are you looking at any top 30 guys? Are you looking at stars and scrubs? Where is my money going in this auction? You can't plan it out to the dollar. You can try, but you can't. But you got to know, like, how am I thinking I'm going to approach this? How do you get your player prices and values? We have projections for auction money on basketballmonster.com, and that adjusts to your league settings. So you put it in and adjust, and you've got to make certain assessments of how you're going to do it. Or you can figure out how you're going to get your prices. But where are you getting them from? Figure out where you are getting your player pricing and player valuations from, because you need to have them. Very hard to go in blind or just relying upon the website that you are drafting off to give you those numbers. And if you're in person, well, you don't even have that coming for you, do you? Get your target list going. Who do you want to get? Where are the values for you? How in depth do you want to get with this? Because you can create many different sort of decision trees of how you're going to choose players. But get a list of targets of guys that you want, guys that you need, guys that you should be looking to pick up. That's important. Work out how you're going to make adjustments in the draft. What are you going to do if this player goes for $10 more than you think? What's your backup plan? Have those things written down, listed out. Well, here's one sort of situation build I've got, but if this guy goes for too much, well, let's restructure. And for every little option of player here, well, yeah, if I've got an extra $5, maybe I'll target this guy. If I've got $5 less, I'll target this guy instead. Plan it out. Tie this all back in. If you do have like the full 10-3 split daily changes, you probably want to have one $1 player, maybe two. If you've got a weekly league, if you've got a roto, if you've got an actual active bench, all of your bench should be $1 players. And then that adjusts how much you spend on the top end players. You need to be able to know these things and understand how to prioritize and make those adjustments. So we're out here. We've got our auction set up. It's ready to go. Be patient early. Be patient. Don't throw everything out there immediately, but there's nearly always someone you would classify as a first-round player that goes too cheap. Your nomination strategy usually should be to drain money away from others. You want to drain money away from others. That should be your nomination strategy. Monitor your opponent's budgets as well. We want to be monitoring your opponent's budgets. How much money do they have left? Because you need to see like who's got money left, who can outbid me, when are we going to start the $1 run, all that stuff becomes important. So when we talk about drain the cash, get it out of the room. Get people to spend that isn't you. Because the more that they spend, right, their money is gone. They cannot then come in and overbid for other players without further hurting themselves. You need to drain money out of the room. It's your key nomination strategy. Don't just nominate the guys that you want. Nominate the guy you don't want. Take somebody else's money. Get it out of there. You want to pay attention to others and what they're doing, what their situation looks like. You need to pocket watch them. Has this guy taken any players? This guy's maximum bid's only 10. Right, so I don't need to go higher than that, do I? I can just throw an 11 on there and I'm good. You need to look at that stuff. What else do we need to look at when we're in draft? You need to be ready. You need to be prepared. You need to be quick to adjust. You need to understand what just happened that changes the dynamic of the room. You need to be cautious about getting caught up in bidding wars. These can be detrimental to your budget or your plan. And it can be hard sometimes to do that, to avoid that sort of a problem. In terms of like being nimble, you've got to adjust. Like, hey, I wanted that guy, but you guys are crazy. You put $20 too much on him. So now you had a number assigned to that player. You didn't get him. And now you've got $20 in your fictional budget left. Where do I put it? Do I give myself extra buffer on 5 other players that I can go a little bit higher now and then still get him with another $5 guy? Or do I go higher and go, well, let's just grab a different $20 player? There are different ways to do that. You've got to know how to do that and how to adjust mid-draft. This is, again, part of the skill thing, part of the preparation thing, because those adjustments are hard to do without practice. Careful of those bidding wars. It's all well and good to have this idea of a must-draft player, or I have to get this guy in my team, but that causes downfall in auction nearly every time. Especially like if you are doing like a balanced type scenario, it's not always going to be just one perfect player. If someone wants to overspend on a player that you thought was value, once they get overspent on, they're not value anymore. So let's just move on to the next one. Because if that player then gets overspent on, that means that somebody else will get underspent on. Now, you don't know who that player is going to be, but if 5 people early on go way too high, that money needs to be moved off of somebody else. So someone else is going to go cheaper. That is just the way that the economics of an auction draft work. Let's look at what else we need to look at here in terms of your nomination strategies. Get the big names out there early. I would try to hang on to my sleeper nominations till later on. No real point putting them out early. Someone else might, but I wouldn't do it myself. And you got to really be paying attention to when that $1 run begins, because that turns an auction draft into a snake draft. When everyone can only bid a maximum of $1, the draft becomes a snake draft. And I think people don't realize that secondary part of an auction. The big names have got to go out. They are the guys who are overpriced. You want that money out of there. You want people to get drained. You want someone to sit there with 3 players on their roster and $50 less because they can go have a snooze for 2 hours because they're just not going to be a part of the proceedings, which is good for you. One less person to bid someone up. You want them out of there. You want the big names out of there, and you want the money out of there. That's the way that you do it. You want to keep your sleepers. Again, you want to keep them where it comes to a situation where maybe 4 guys can't bid on them. The less competition you have for the players that you want, the easier it is to get them and the better the pricing becomes. So don't throw out the guy that you're desperate to get. There'll be the occasion where you can throw them out and everyone misses it and they slide through and you get them for cheap. That is true. But as a general rule, that doesn't work continually. It's not a real great strategy, I don't think. And just watch the $1. Work out when that is going to happen. Because once that happens, it does turn into a snake. Whoever you nominate, you get with $1. And that becomes a different dynamic in the draft. So we've looked at our in-draft strategies, the bidding strategies. Just in terms of etiquette-wise, if someone's a $40 player, don't put a $5 bid on them. Just put it up to $30. Get it out there. Make your bids not $5 or $10. Make them 1s and 7s and 6s. It's just a psychology. Change your psychology. In some of your bids, you change what you do. Don't hyper-focus on one player. Be careful of price enforcement. We're going to go through all of these individual points in a second. But there's so many different parts and pieces of what we do in an auction format. So don't waste everyone's time. Don't nominate them for $1 when it's a $70 player. Nominate them at $50. No one's going to fall for it. It's not going to slide through. Get the money out, man. Just get it speeding up. It's already a long process. Don't think that you're being slick and making everyone bid $1 increments on a $70 player. Just etiquette-wise, just get them out, man. Let's get them out. Be very mindful of the pricing increments. Again, it's a weird price of a 39, a 41 is better than a 40. So if you're going to jump to a weird number, don't do them in $5 or $10. It's the same way that shops use their retail ideas. $23.99 is the same price as $24, but it seems cheaper. So there's a psychology attached to numbers that you can use to somewhat of your advantage. Not massively, but you can. You can, the psychology is really important here. Like there'll be different ways that you can approach a player that you want. And I think you've got to mix it up. You have to mix it up. If there's a player that you want and you immediately chuck a counter bid on them every time, well, then the people bidding against you will know that. It's like poker. It's like a tell. Like, well, he wants this guy. I'll just keep bidding him up. Right? And then you get forced to pay extra money. You got to mix that part in with a nonchalant, I actually don't know if I want this guy, or wait on a bid, or be like, oh, I'm really at my limit. Can I go $1 more? Wait till it really runs down and put it in there. You want everyone to be guessing your idea. You don't want the idea to be, this guy is going to go way higher than this player, so he's bidding early, and he might be out here, and you bid late. You mix it up. You have to mix it up. So you bid hard, bid fast. Throw $5 extra on if you want to stamp your authority, but don't always do it. Let the clock run down in the situations where you are actually at your budget, but also in situations when you're not. So the other people don't get your strategies. So the other people don't get your tendencies. You need to be able to work both sides of that. Working psychology is huge. Price enforcement, what does that mean? It's a player that you don't want. They're a $50 player and they're sitting at 30, going once, going to screw this. No way. No way am I letting them get a player for $20 worth of value. Be really cautious about it. Make sure that that player that you get is actually going to be okay for you. Now, if there's $20 of value in a player, that will work every single time. Even so, if you get stuck with them, that is fine. But don't try to squeeze, like they're a $50 player and they're sitting at 47. I reckon I can get them to 50. Because if you get them at 48, A, you've got no value, and B, that wasn't a player you were targeting. Your whole strategy is thrown out the window. Price enforcement could be good. Sometimes goading people into price enforcement is also another strategy, but that's probably getting a little bit too advanced there. Again, there's a lot of psychology that goes into this stuff. So keep that in mind. Don't hyper-focus on a player. Don't be like, I must have this guy. What is your limit on a player? I've got him as a $40 player, but I will go to 43. Hey, I got two guys earlier and saved $15. Maybe I can push him to 45. Don't be like, I need this guy. You can find other ways to get players in. You can do it. There's a lot more detail on a lot of these things that we can go to. But get your budget out. Work your budget. I wouldn't spread my budget on the entire roster. I would leave 1 to 2 players as $1 guys, which you can drop for streaming. The larger your bench, the weekly lineups means you do more of that. What I want to do is get a 50% value increase, which I'll talk about in a second. I want to adjust my prices during the draft. The deeper your bench is, the more your $1 players are, and create your decision trees about how you're going to build this out, how you're going to structure your setup, your lineups, your build. So when I talk about the you don't use the whole roster, you don't $200 and 13 players, you don't spend the $200 on 13. You might spend it on 12 or 11, but not on 13, because then you've got no flexibility. You can't drop somebody. You can't add a waiver wire guy without losing $10 or $6 worth of auction value from a top 70 guy. That's all well and good to have 13 top 70 guys, but you do need to have a little bit of flexibility, because as good as your team is, right, someone who aggressively streams during the week can still beat you. So you've got to have the ability to be able to do that part of it as well. So that's why I wouldn't spend it on all of my roster. The 50% value increase is like, you've worked out initially your value of players, how you see them. You've got $200 as an example number to spend. Aim to get the players on your team worth $300. You might get 270, you might get 310, you might get 280. Aim for 50% increase. So 50% increase on 200 is 300. It's a very good way of having a super strong team. And that can be through punt strategies or whatever. Aim for that extra. Aim for that 50% is a way that you want to attack that. I think that's a really, really good rule of thumb to have. Adjust based on the price environment. We talked about it earlier about the context of the draft. Has every top end player gone for $10 below valuation? Well, guess what? Everyone's going balanced. Adjust what you do. Maybe you do start to lean into grabbing some of those high end guys, because at some point $10 undervalue is $10 undervalue. Now that might be $10 under the draft site's value or $10 under your value. So don't say, well, I have to go balanced. I can't grab a star because that's not the plan I had when every star is going for way too cheap, because that actually ends up way better. Then you can build a super strong team. Adjust based on what is actually going on inside your draft. And only you can know that at the time. You've got to make those adjustments. The deeper your bench is, the more the $1 players you have, because you won't be using them. The 10-3 split means you use every bench player. A 10-5 split means two of those guys probably won't get used, so they're stashable guys. You do not need to devote resources to that. The deeper your bench is, the more $1 players you have. And that's how you should assess the rest of your league as well. And create decision trees, like I said. Like, I'm going to take this guy for 20, but what if I've got extra money? Who are the other guys that I take? Who are some other guys that are worth 20? Who are some guys that are worth 15 if I just don't have quite enough money to get me 90% of this guy's production? Have your decision trees of what you're going to do. And that might be, I've got my initial 13 names here, and there's another 30 over here that all sort of tie into if this happens and this happens, or alternate builds. Build 1A, build 1B, build 1C, however you want to frame that. Lastly, I want to throw out an example of something I put together in about 2 minutes. And I just don't say 2 minutes because I was being lazy, but just how quickly you can actually try and find where the value sits. So I use the Yahoo average auction prices. Now, the Yahoo average auction prices may not be how that goes in your league. Your league might not, abide by those numbers. They might look at projected numbers. I'm not sure. But I use that. I put 12 players because I'm holding space for a $1 flyer. And the price of these 12 players came out to, using Yahoo's average, $179. Now, if I'm going to build a budget out, I'm not going to budget my roster to be $199 and I've got $1 for my last player, because that gives you no flexibility. I'd like to build it to $190 and see it. That gives me a $10 buffer that then I can add on to players as the draft goes on, or take away depending on, I'm sitting at plus 10 at the moment. I saved $3 here. Now I'm plus 13. I went 5 over. I'm plus 8. But in this one here, like, I built 12 guys out, and on average would cost me $179. Now, if you look at the Yahoo projected dollar, it's $236. So how does your league view that? There's a big discrepancy there. Average is just how much these guys have been going for. So I think that's a pretty good representation at the moment. There are some risky guys in here for sure, but there is value, like LaMelo Ball, Fred VanVleet, Jalen Williams, the Bronco, DeJounte Murray, Evan Mobley, Emmanuel Quickley, Alperen Şengün, DeAndre Ayton, the Thick Hogsman, Tobias Harris, Julius Randle, Cam Thomas, and D'Angelo Russell. That's 12 guys. Not one of those guys I think is outside the top 75. And I theoretically have $21 left over. So I can actually upgrade some of those spots. And my team averages with those 12 guys, 21 points, 2 threes, 6.5 boards, 5.5 assists, 1.1 steals, 0.6 blocks. On a team that's punting field goals, I shoot 48%. My free throws are at 81. My turnovers are 2.2. I could do better than this probably. I've got plenty of room to actually improve this with an extra $21 there. But that was just quickly put together of a way to build a 12-man balanced roster, which honestly, pretty hard to beat, I reckon. That's a pretty good... Look, obviously, anyone gets hurt, that can kill you. And if LaMelo does go down, oh well. I'm actually relatively insulated because I haven't spent that much. It's $26. It's not that much. I can recover that. So, that's my sort of introduction to auction drafts. I hope that those things made sense to you guys. I hope that you're able to get something out of that. And I hope it's useful. Auction mock coming this week at some point. Don't know the exact day. Be on the lookout for it. Follow the show, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere else. Thumb it up, comments. I think you know how it goes. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.